What should we expect from Nod Krai? This feels like yet another make or break moment for Genshin. Since the game's release 5 years ago, fans have highlighted major problems with the game and suggested easy fixes, and Hoyo always seemed reluctant to make even minor changes. After all, the game's success remained untouched. In the last year or so, as competition in the gacha space began to heat up, they finally started to move the dial on quality of life. And then, after the Natlan archon quests were finished, they posted an extra developer livestream which acknowledged many of the storytelling issues which I and many others have been pointing out for years. And so, the rebranding of version 6.0 to Lunar 1 feels symbolic. In the Nod Krai livestream, they mentioned the desire to keep evolving the game so that it can last for years to come, and willingness to change their storytelling methods to support that. Could this be the fresh start that many feel the game needs? Since storytelling tends to be the part I talk about the most, let's start there. I was very happy to see that developer livestream where they acknowledged that they've done a poor job of telling the story they're trying to portray. Many of the things they talked about seem to echo the critiques I've covered in videos in the past, though the one they focused on the most was the gap between the story they're trying to tell through the deeper lore and what they present to us in the main narrative itself. Personally, I feel there are more immediate concerns. The presentation, the basic structure of each chapter, the clarity of the dialogue, the pacing itself, and so on have long been problem areas, and if they don't fix those, then any improved connection to the lore will still fall flat for many players as a result. However, as I explored in my previous video, they've done a great job at improving on these points in the events in this past year, and the world quests in Natlan were fantastic too. If they continue that trajectory, then Nod Krai storytelling fundamentals could be a very good foundation. So, in a way, I can understand their focus. If they can keep up the quality of those other areas, then the connection between the lore and the narrative is their next big challenge. This point sparked a lot of discussions. Is Genshin bad at delivering lore, or are the players just not paying enough attention? Hoyo are good at scattering crumbs of lore throughout the world for enterprising people to collect and compare and put together to figure out the wider story. That kind of storytelling has a lot of fans, especially in the open world niche, but it does not appeal to everyone. This is one of the reasons Genshin's YouTube lore community is so beloved by so many people who don't have the time to search things out for themselves. People talk a lot about show versus tell when discussing this decision, but it tends to be framed with the lore scattered in the world as the show and anything explained in quests as the tell. I've seen people say that making the lore more prominent in the quest would dumb down the storytelling because by necessity it would mean removing the challenge of finding it for yourself. They seem to think that the only options are Elden Ring style storytelling or making everything surface level. There's much more to it than that. My favourite stories have many layers, especially the ones whose release spans years or even decades, like Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, and it's up to you how deep you want to delve. At the start, you don't need much context to understand what's going on, but as you learn about the characters and the universe they inhabit, there are hints and puzzles all over the place which an observant person can pay attention to if they want to understand the deeper context and get a sense of where the wider narrative is going. Over time, some of these hints become more prominent, more relevant to the story at hand, and you start to see the theories people crafted becoming not just confirmed, but actively important and central to the immediate events. The people who like to delve into the lore get the satisfaction of seeing their speculation confirmed, becoming a cornerstone which underpins the main narrative. The people who focus on the story get a slower reveal which pieces things together over time, without the writing resorting to painful info dumps. And since there are many layers to the lore, whenever something which was once a mystery becomes common knowledge, there are still countless layers underneath to hint at, to speculate about, to piece together an understanding of, and to look forward to more slow reveals over time. Another point of comparison is the different levels of depth you'll find in books and films. Take Lord of the Rings, for example. Naturally, the books have a level of depth and breadth which was impossible to translate to film, and the people who take the time to read the story will have a deeper understanding of the world. But all the same, I think most people would agree that those films don't dumb down the story. They focus on what's relevant, provide a slow reveal of the lore which matters to the story at hand, and they leave in subtle hints at things which didn't make the cut. And then you have the Silmarillion, a collection of myths, legends, and historical chronicles which further fleshes out the world. This is what I'd hope to see from games like Genshin. The deeper lore would be their Silmarillion, though it would include all the same hints towards the things which are relevant to the main storyline. The Archon quest should be like the films, a streamlined narrative which organically introduces the major concepts, shows the relevant lore to you without needless info dumps, and combines it all into a compelling story. And then the world and character quests would be more akin to the wider story that you get if you read the books themselves. It's that movement from lore to main story relevance where Hoyo have at best been inconsistent so far. There have been isolated areas where they've done it well, but there are so many concepts which are supposed to be vital to the logic of the world which have not been adequately explored for anyone who's here for a more traditional action RPG narrative experience. Personally, I'm here for the main narrative first and foremost, but I love it when there are those hints of depth, and when I'm given a reason to care, I'll happily dive deeper into it. In Genshin, that disconnect between the narrative and the lore has meant that I have less motivation to do so. I love the stories which manage to take some steps along that path, but I'm not one who enjoys finding lore for its own sake. I want them to make that experience better, but that doesn't have to come at the cost of lessening the depth of the experience for people who do enjoy reading scraps of text throughout the world and piecing together a hidden narrative for themselves. I don't think there's any incentive for them to stop doing that. It's clearly a storytelling technique that they're actually good at, after all. So how do they intend to actually make this change? One thing they're leaning into heavily is that Nod Krai is a melting pot with many factions at play. Previous regions focused on a single nation with a single central conflict, and many threads were left dangling by the end of each chapter of the story. Nod Krai intends to pick up some of those threads and weave them into a more cohesive canvas, while providing us with much more fractious location to explore than we've really seen before. All the factions sound cool in concept, but I think the focus on their sheer number highlights the wrong thing here. After all, Natlan had many separate tribes, but since the tribes all got along so well with one another, their differences had surprisingly little effect on the narrative. Instead, the reason Nod Krai sounds exciting to me is that there are very obvious lines of conflict inherent in the way the factions are described. There's a rich and detailed history of alliances, enmity, and betrayal. There are outside forces pushing for their own agenda. There are new events at play which may tip the balance. As a basic setup, it sounds fantastic. Far from being filler, it's plausible that almost every patch could see important events play out, key storylines come to fruition, and seeds of future conflict firmly planted. What remains to be seen is whether Hoyo can make the most of it. They also mentioned that many of the stories will be more organic. Most importantly, each character's backstory will be tightly integrated into the main Archon quest without that clear separation between the two. There's also a new meeting point system, which is intended to let us explore everyday lives of characters in place of story quests or hangouts. To me, this sounds like the next step in a direction they've been trying out since the start of Natlan. In previous regions, all the types of quests were largely separate. At most, you would be blocked from starting the storyline until you'd completed an earlier one, which was relevant, but most stories were largely isolated from the rest of the world. In Natlan, the quest for the 5-star from each tribe was replaced with tribal chronicles, which aimed to explore their tribe's culture as well as the character themselves, a mix of world quest and character story. The chronicles were kinda mixed in the end for me, but in general I like this as a concept and it has a lot of potential if done right. And it also sounds like they're taking inspiration from the Traveler's Tales, since those events were widely praised. It was wonderful to have characters just present in the world, to have fun interactions with them, and little storylines where we see them going on about their lives, having new experiences, and deepening their relationships with one another. Some were tiny little anecdotes, others were many episodes long with surprisingly poignant character moments. My only complaint with them was that they were not permanent, and not only have the Traveler's Tales themselves been made permanent going forward, it sounds like they may be more tightly integrated into the large narrative. As an approach to storytelling, this sounds like it has a ton of potential. If they can do it right, it could feel like a more linear echo of something like Baldur's Gate on a much smaller scale. A world with characters you can interact with, whose stories progress through smaller interactions and intertwine into something with greater depth than would have been possible with the traditional quest structure. And again, it's a risky decision. If Hoyo are actually aiming for something like that, it would be a fundamental shift in how they tell their stories. Far more ambitious, and it would be interesting to see if they can get it right. I'd still be happy with this change if it remains a little disconnected from the Archon quest, and all that it really does is break out the character stories so that they're a little less isolated from the rest of the experience. But if they do take that extra step and make them influence the main plot as well, it would be even better. It's also interesting to see that the open world will now behave differently depending on which character you have on field. Animals will interact with Lauma, the Wild Hunt's words are intelligible to Flints, and there will likely be more in future too. To be honest, I kinda dislike this idea. I've always felt that any pretense that we're wandering around Teyvat with the characters on our team actually trudging along with us breaks immersion, partly because there's no way many of the characters would consider leaving their existing lives, but more because the world doesn't react to them any differently. Imagine how the NPCs in Watasumi should react if they see the Raiden Shogun casually walking down the street. think how Furina's adoring fans would fawn over her when she wanders through Fontaine. It is a cool detail to have for those specific characters, but it highlights the dissonance I've always felt at the idea of wandering the world with our team so far. I'd be surprised if they add anything like this to older characters, and even if they do, there's no way it'd be major enough to truly show the difference you'd expect. This is the kind of interactivity which makes the world feel more alive, but I guess I have to wait and see how the contrast makes things feel when you don't have these characters on field. Since by now I'm used to the NPCs showing no reaction, I guess it'll probably feel fine, but I shall reserve the right to grumble. I do find it interesting that in the livestream they stated that this close integration between story quests and archon quests will not become the new standard, and instead is specific to Nod Krai. I'd imagine that if this is a success, they may decide to continue with that approach, at least for some portion of the quests in the future. If it is not, then it makes sense to go back to more separate stories. I like the fact that they're experimenting and trying to find ways to avoid the mistakes they've made in the past. There are many things about the ideas they've outlined which sound promising, and while they'll probably keep it relatively simple, there are ways they could take those changes to another level. Genshin still has so much potential, and it still struggles to reach the heights it could, so it was a little odd to hear that these changes won't be permanent. Guess we'll just have to wait and see what it really means. Now, let's take a look at the other major changes. Lots of people are uneasy about the lunar reactions and moon sign resonance, partly because they're a risk of power creep, and partly because they restrict team building since you need specific characters on the team in order to trigger them. I don't think we can come to any clear conclusion until we're a few patches in and have more evidence of how the Nod Krai characters will work in practice. My hope is that lunar reactions end up feeling more like Nilo's bountiful blooms, which made her into a powerful and useful character with a clear and well-defined niche without skewing the balance of the rest of the game, while moon sign resonance could maybe feel about as useful as elemental resonance. If that's what they're going for, then this could mean that each Nod Krai character can be unique and useful in their own area and have some interesting synergies with one another while still working great with older characters, all without the worry of competing with existing characters for their existing roles, and with less incentive on Hoyo's part to drive up the ambient power creep. It is, of course, a little sad that the whole new reactions thing would boil down to just a bunch of new Nilos, but it's not the worst approach they could have taken. They've said that the reactions are designed to encourage synergy between characters and to provide new avenues for experimentation. It's up to each person how much trust they have that Hoyo can achieve that without it being even more annoying than Night Soul. Personally, I'm on the fence. I think I can see the vision they're setting out, and from a distance it sounds promising, but even after seeing some numbers, it feels too early to judge until we're out there experiencing it for ourselves. The new artifact sets are kinda interesting with this in mind. As usual, there's one for on-field DPS characters and one for off-field supports, and they're both specific to teams with lunar reactions. They provide half their potential primary buff if there's only one lunar character in the team, and the full amount if there are two. The worry, again, is that this may be restrictive in terms of team building, since if these sets are significantly better than the alternatives, then many new characters would find themselves locked into a smaller space of potential synergies than they would have otherwise. My take on it is that it's pretty similar to Marechaussee Hunter in many ways. While they're triggered by lunar characters, they can be equipped by anyone. I have several DPS characters who I've built with Marechaussee, even though that means they are inherently tied to Furina. And since Furina requires a healer, that means that their teams are even more restrictive. There's only one remaining slot available to experiment with. This always felt like an interesting trade-off to me. Do you want to max out your potential but lock the character into a smaller set of teams, or do you want to make them playable with more variety? As long as either option is viable in the endgame content, does it really matter? It's a little different when that same logic is applied to a support set where it adds another dimension of restrictions, but it's not a huge difference. Personally, I don't mind the Nod Krai set. As long as the characters have alternatives which are still viable, I'm fine missing out on a little DPS if I want to try out some more unusual teams. But what I really want as a solution to this is loadouts, so that I can do both without such annoying hassle. Next, the big one. They announced a way to raise characters to level 100 and decided to lock it behind the gacha system. When you pull an extra copy of a C6 5-star, you get a special Masterless Stella Fortuna item, which can raise a level 90 character to level 95, and you need 2 more to raise a level 95 character to 100. I I always felt that the star glitter rewards for losing a 50-50 to a C6 standard character were laughably small, and that there should be something to soften the blow, but I'm unconvinced this will be good for the balance of the game. I think the reason this gets people's hackles up is that it takes a dimension of character strength which used to be universally achievable and locks it behind monetization. Constellations and weapon refinements were two dimensions which were already monetized, but they were balanced out by artifacts, talents, and character levels. With the original setup, even free-to-play players could C6R5 their one true favorite if they saved for long enough. This new feature breaks from that original setup and places the reward squarely in the hands of whales alone, or of course those long-term players who've been extremely unlucky with their pulls and have somehow lost all their 50-50s to a handful of characters. I've always been sympathetic to the perspective that whales deserve something in return for their support, but the extra strength from C6R5 characters was already a massive gap, especially with later characters, and I always felt that any rewards beyond that should be cosmetic. I actually don't mind the flashy temporary weapon skins from the Stygian Onslaught, for example. At the end of the day, whether this all matters or not is still up in the air. It's unclear how significantly it will affect the game's balance. Some characters will benefit from the stat upgrades more than others. If they don't change the formulas at all, then transformative reactions would benefit even more than most. And there's also the whole damage scaling level differential thing to throw into the equation too. If it just means whales get even faster clear time, but it doesn't affect anything else, then I guess it's not the end of the world. But after this past year's HP inflation in Genshin and Star Rail, I do not trust Hoyo to refrain from adding power creep. And the final change that I'd consider major is the permanently recurring free constellation event. While some may see it as generous that this exists at all, for me it's a clear example of Genshin's tendency to come up with a really cool idea which could have made a huge difference, but adds so many caveats that it's hard not to feel disappointed in the end. Every couple of patches, we'll be able to select an older character and through completing weekly training goals gain some valuable items. A Crown of Insight, a Sanctifying Elixir, Dust of Enlightenment, and we'll gain one constellation for their selected character. However, it's only available for standard characters plus a selection of older characters released before Fontaine, and excluding the ones people are likely to still use in endgame content, which is the only content where power matters in the first place. Archons are, of course, excluded, but it feels pretty pointed that Alhaitham, Yelan, and Kazuha were also omitted from the list. The very three I instantly thought of getting a constellation for when I heard this was limited to Sumeru characters or earlier. The charitable interpretation of this would be that it's a way for them to bump up old units who have been affected by power creep, but if that's the goal, the implementation is flawed. The constellations for these older characters are often underwhelming, so the additional restrictions that you can only unlock one for each character through this system really sucks the joy from it. I'm never going to pull for higher constellations for any character, but if I could have stacked this event's reward onto only one, that would have been awesome. C6 Shenhe, Yamiko, Yoimiya, Klee, any of them would have found a completely new lease on life on my account, and this event would have absolutely done its job. As it is, every single constellation I could potentially get would make negligible difference, and instead I'm probably going to stack them onto the C6 standard characters to at least get a couple of characters to level 95 instead. Feels like such a waste. As an antidote to those depressing thoughts, let's move on to the quality of life upgrades. There are a few which stood out to me. The final substat on 3-line artifacts will now be visible, which means I'll finally go through my 1000 maybe artifacts and get rid of the ones which aren't worth saving without wasting so much time and effort leveling each one to 4 just in case. Even better is that we'll be able to use artifact EXP materials to create elixir once per version. It was always such a pain in the past because it only allowed those level 4 artifacts to be used as fuel. I can't wait to never need to waste my time leveling crap artifacts just for this. The resin upgrade is great too. Spending 40 resin at once or 60 for condensed will cut down on so much repetition, though I still wish they'd let us fight domain once and redeem multiple. And I'm also happy to have more slots to save teams into, though as someone who has 80 characters fully built with their own separate weapon and set of artifacts, this is still a tiny fraction of the full suite of teams I'd like to actually save into my system. Another one I like a lot is the Treasure Compass upgrade, which marks all remaining chests and oculi on the map once you've completed enough content. My main worry for this kind of feature is that it can lead to the devs becoming a bit less careful about how they place puzzles and chests in the open world. If players are expected to use a tool to tell them where things are, then there's no need for the devs to waste time crafting the surroundings to subtly point players towards points of interest, so they often just don't bother. When that happens, for people like me who prefer to explore without the aids at first, it ends up making the exploration a little less engaging. However, in this case, it isn't available from the start and you unlock it later on. Hopefully, this means that the new features inclusion won't lessen the exploration experience for those of us who do find it fun to explore for ourselves, and aren't doing it just to fuel our gambling addiction. And of course, it wouldn't be Hoyo if they didn't add something else we've been asking for years and add a really annoying caveat to it. It was so exciting to hear them say that domains will be available for every day, but then it turned out that it's only for the first 7 days at the start of each banner and only for the materials that the banner characters require. That might sound like a nitpick, but remember, it also adds a little bit of extra pressure to people who aren't sure whether to pull for a character. If they want to take advantage, they would either have to decide pretty quickly or farm the materials first and decide later, which would bring its own subtle pressure of not wanting all the resin to have gone to waste. It's almost comical that they just refuse to make this simple change permanent. The code exists, and the only purpose of limiting the domains is to make it inconvenient for us. There's still a ton of rough edges in this game which would benefit a lot from some simple changes. A dialogue skip button, artifact and weapon loadouts, event weapons in the shop, portable crafting, converting excess boss drops to other materials, anything to fix the pain of wanting 4 stars, and so on. I really wish they'd add difficulty level customization. One of the other updates in Nod Krai is that they reduced the difficulty of co-op mode. This is something I'd have loved back when I was AR45 or so, but right now co-op is extremely easy, and I'd love the ability to make it more of a challenge. And the same goes for the overworld too, especially with the addition of level 100, which feels like such an obvious requirement. I just want a slider which lets me ramp up the level of the enemies in the overworld. I don't even need extra drops. And with the Masterless Stella Fortuna comes a new request. If this system exists for 5-star, can we please get something for 4 stars too? That would be far less whale specific, so I guess it isn't likely to happen, but it would soften the blow of getting yet another Ningguang to add to my collection. I've already pulled well over 50 copies of her after all. Of course, were they to do that, I guess we could all but guarantee it would have a huge effect on power creep, so perhaps it's better this way after all. The other major update which deserves some attention is Miliastra Wonderland, the new user-generated content system which they're adding to Genshin in a future update. I often enjoy event minigames, always wish we had co-op puzzles and combat challenges, and forever want more varied endgame, so I'm hoping that this will let players create engaging new ways for us to enjoy the game. But at the same time, this whole thing is kinda irrelevant to the parts of the game I care about the most right now, the exploration and the story. Hoyo have been doing a great job of improving exploration over time, which is a statement I've explained in depth in a couple of recent videos, but the storytelling still needs a lot of work. My hope here is that Miliastra Wonderland doesn't distract them too much from delivering on the promises elsewhere. It does feel very separate, so perhaps it's being run by a separate team who can just access Genshin's assets. To be honest, it feels like it should be a separate game. It's kind of weird that it's tacked on to Genshin, though I can see why they'd want to do that. I'm curious to see how well it works. Despite the sour notes, and despite the many legitimate concerns, there's so much to be excited for about Nod Krai. It'll be fascinating to see how this different approach to storytelling pans out. They're making so many changes all at once, far more than we've ever seen before, and I, for one, am excited to experience it for myself. I'm withholding judgment on the rest. There is potential, but there's also every chance this could all end badly for anyone who doesn't want to wail if the HP inflation continues to accelerate. But one thing's for sure, the new region looks amazing. I cannot wait to go explore. Until next time.